Hey guys, today we're diving into one of the strangest sagas of medieval faith, a story that begins not with holiness, but with a young woman shoved into a convent against her will. Imagine being 17, too clever for your own good, and suddenly told that your life is over before it's begun. That was the fate of Lucia of Monferrat. You probably wouldn't survive this, at least not with your sanity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me your location and what time it is where you're watching. It's always fascinating to see the community scattered across the globe. Night owls and early birds together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are stepping into the convent of St. Margaret. The door shuts behind you with a sound like finality, and the draught of cold stone air tells you freedom is a thing of the past. The corridors echo, every sound amplified, as though even your heartbeat must be reported to the heavens. The routine hits immediately. Bells at 4 a.m., prayers that drag longer than dawn itself, meals of boiled roots and stale bread, and silence. Not thoughtful, meditative silence, but the kind that gnaws at you. The rulebook says joy is suspicious, laughter is heresy, and obedience is salvation. Lucia hated every bit of it. On her first day, she asked if the abbess's sermon came in a shorter version. On her second, she fell asleep during prayers standing up. And when challenged about her irreverence, she quipped, "If God wanted me awake at this hour, he'd make dawn later." That earned her her first punishment, but also her nickname, Sister Problem. While most nuns buried their hunger and boredom in endless weaving and whispered penance, Lucia sharpened her eyes instead. She watched, she listened, she catalogued the little hypocrisies around her. Who snuck extra bread, who loathed the abbess but kissed her ring anyway, who might trade a joke for honey. Within weeks, she knew more secrets than the bishop and weaponized them with sarcasm. Meals were punishment disguised as nourishment, cold fish that tasted of despair, gray porridge designed to remind you of poverty. When Lucia tried spicing hers with herbs from the garden, she was accused of culinary pride. She apologized by suggesting the abbess add a little salt to her sermons, too. Confession became her playground. Some nuns visited twice, daily just to break the silence. Lucia went once a week, just to amuse herself. When asked if she had sinned, she shrugged and replied, "Not yet, but I have plans." Silence itself became her enemy. She hummed under her breath, tapped on wooden benches, whispered Latin puns that no one wanted to admit were funny. Other sisters prayed for her so loudly enough that the irony burned hotter than incense. In secret, her rebellion spread to cloth. She stitched tiny, sarcastic phrases into altar embroidery. "Blessed are the bored, and God grant me patience, but not now." For the villagers outside, the convent looked holy. Inside, it was one long experiment in slow-motion madness, a crucible where hunger, fatigue, and despair were supposed to melt you into obedience. But not Lucia. To her, every rule was a dare, every sermon a challenge, and beneath her wit, something restless was growing. She was done with silence, done with submission. And the first spark of her legend would begin not with a prayer, but with a drink. The convent's wine cellar was supposed to be holy ground. Dark, cool, stacked with barrels of sacramental wine reserved only for the Eucharist. A place of ritual purity, not indulgence. But to a 17-year-old nun who thought boredom was the devil's true invention, those barrels looked less like symbols of Christ's blood and more like the only entertainment left on earth. One evening, while the sisters knelt in the chapel whispering prayers for humility, Lucia whispered something different to two conspirators, equally young, equally restless, equally desperate for a taste of life. With candles trembling in their hands, they crept down to the cellar. Imagine the air down there, damp stone, dust, the sharp scent of oak and grape. Imagine your own heartbeat hammering as you lifted a lid not meant to be touched. At first, they called it quality control. A small sip, just to be sure the sacrament remained intact. But the sip turned into mugs, the mugs into laughter, the laughter into something larger than them all. For the first time, silence fractured not with chants or hymns, but with choking giggles echoing off stone. They raised their cups as though toasting freedom itself, and in that moment, real joy felt like contraband. The next morning, prayers sounded more like groans. Heads ached, knees buckled, hymns slurred. The abbess smelled wine in the air and thundered about Satan's corruption. Lucia, unfazed, replied, "The Spirit moved through us, Mother, just not the one you expected." That might have been the end of it, but something had changed. Lucia had discovered that laughter itself was power. In a place built to crush individuality, she'd found the crack in the wall. Humor. Soon the younger nuns were sneaking bread to one another, whispering jokes in the middle of psalms, rolling their eyes at punishments like schoolgirls rather than penitents. The abbess blamed the devil. Lucia blamed bad management. Her punishments escalated. 1 month, she was ordered to copy scripture endlessly, ink staining her fingers until they blistered. But she filled the margins with doodle saints, yawning, angels asleep, and in one corner, a sketch of the abbess with ears so long she looked like a donkey. When confronted, Lucia clasped her hands piously and claimed divine inspiration. Whispers began to drift beyond the convent walls. Priests murmured about the girl who mocked Latin. Prayers. Merchants joked about the wine-loving nun. Monks who visited for confession suddenly found more excuses to return. St. Margaret's, once a fortress of austerity, had become a rumor mill. One merchant claimed he saw nuns laughing behind the walls after sunset, and others swore they could hear faint music drifting out when the wind carried right. Rumor hardened into certainty. Something unholy, or perhaps too human, was happening inside. Lucia didn't care. To her, rebellion wasn't just survival, it was art. She began throwing midnight feasts in the refectory. Bread stolen from the kitchen, herbs from the garden, watered-down wine disguised as a new kind of prayer. She called it celebrating divine creation. The abbess called it sacrilege. What would you have done? If you were trapped in a stone cage with nothing but repetition and silence for the rest of your life, would you risk punishment for a taste of freedom? Would you laugh, even if laughter itself could damn you? For Lucia, the answer was obvious, and so the convent's nights grew noisier, its walls thinner, and her legend sharper. She wasn't simply breaking rules anymore. She was bending theology until it snapped. The abbess tried to double fasting days. Lucia responded with bigger feasts. Silence was ordered after sunset. Lucia began scheduling her gatherings at dawn. Every restriction became fuel for another act of defiance. And as the whispers turned to gossip, and gossip to scandal, the line between mischief and catastrophe grew perilously thin. Soon the convent would discover that joy, especially when bottled, can spread faster than any plague. And this time, the consequences wouldn't be hidden behind laughter. They would be carved into flesh, scandal, and history. It started with whispers, the kind that crawl along stone walls and slip under doors. A novice looking pale, then another sister fainting during prayer, and soon the rumors hardened into something undeniable. Bellies beginning to swell inside a convent, where such things were supposed to be impossible. Pregnancy was not just a scandal. It was an explosion waiting to happen. Imagine the panic. The abbess white as the wax dripping from the altar candles, the confessor sweating under his robes, the novices clutching their rosaries until beads snapped. A convent was meant to be a fortress against the world, and now the world, or something far more dangerous, had clearly crept inside. Lucia, of course, stood back with folded arms and the faintest smile. When chaos erupted, she shrugged and said, "Well, miracles do happen." The church moved fast. Priests were summoned, servants interrogated, midwives brought in under the guise of medical consultation. Every sister was questioned, every chamber searched. The abbess swore the devil himself had walked into St. Margaret's. Lucia quietly agreed. She just left out that he might have walked in through the front gate wearing a cassock. When cornered, one trembling young nun broke down in tears, confessing that Sister Lucia told us joy was holy. That didn't help. Lucia denied everything with the poise of someone who had rehearsed in the mirror. Temptation? Yes. Moonlight? Certainly. Weak wine? Possibly. But her direct hand in it? Only in faith, she replied, and perhaps in poor decisions. The tribunal came next. 3 solemn men, quills sharp as knives, set up their table beneath a fresco of the Last Judgment. The irony dripped heavier than the wax on their candles. Testimonies were gathered, evidence produced, wine barrels hidden in a cellar corner, a small box of jewelry tucked behind a statue, letters signed only with a mysterious initial romantic, lyrical, damning. When asked to explain, Lucia tilted her head and said, "Perhaps God writes to all women through the hands of men." The scribe froze, quill hovering, unsure whether to label her words heresy or poetry. Witnesses trembled as they spoke. Some insisted Lucia was kind. Others swore she was the devil in a wimple. Father Gregor underlined that phrase twice. One novice confessed Lucia had taught her to laugh during Lent. Another whispered that she had been told dancing was a sacred prayer. Lucia did not flinch. When accused of corrupting her sisters, she answered, "If joy misleads, then sorrow must be salvation." That line alone would find its way into more than one bishop's diary. The verdict, of course, was predetermined. The tribunal declared her guilty of scandalous conduct and corruption of the holy vocation. Her punishment, public penance, barefoot through the streets, and lifetime confinement in a stricter convent. Picture the day of her humiliation. Bare feet on cobblestones, a coarse wool sack replacing her black habit, a candle dripping faster than she walked. The people lined the streets, peasants whispering, merchants smirking, a woman even calling out. At least she made the church interesting again. Priests chanted psalms of meekness while Lucia muttered her own commentary. "Blessed are the meek." Temporarily, she whispered back. At the cathedral steps, she knelt. Instead of tears, she looked up at the bishop and said, "If joy is sin, then forgive me for spreading it." Her voice carried across the square. Some gasped, some laughed, and one boy in the crowd clapped before his mother smacked his hand down. By dusk, her fate was sealed. She would be marched to a fortress convent outside Siena, a place built not for devotion, but containment. There, silence would be stricter, fasting harsher, freedom impossible. But as the gates closed behind her, Lucia whispered to herself, "Perfect. I've been meaning to work on my inner life." And just like that, the church thought it had buried the scandal. Instead, it had planted the seeds of legend. The new convent doesn't welcome you so much as swallow you. It sits on a hill outside Siena like a clenched fist, walls high enough to keep out sunlight and doubt alike. Inside, the corridors are narrower, the air colder, and the rules distilled to their bitterest essence. Here, silence isn't a discipline, it's an atmosphere. You open your mouth, and the stone seems to press a finger to your lips. They strip Lucia of everything that might resemble comfort. The fine habit becomes rough wool that scratches where it can't be ignored. Her cell holds a pallet, a crucifix, and a window slit that admits only a ribbon of moon. "Here you will find peace," the abbess says in the tone of a jailer announcing visiting hours. Lucia bows and replies, "If I do, I'll let you know." That earns her 6 hours kneeling on bare stone. Days begin before dawn, a bell tolling like a reminder that the world outside keeps time too. Breakfast is bread designed by God to test teeth. Work is prayer, prayer is work, and all of it is measured. Breaths counted, glances policed, shoulders corrected by a tap of wood. Even birds learn to quiet themselves against this place, as if chirping were immodest. Most people crack here, even the obedient. Lucia refuses to. She saves fragments of candle stubs and melts them slowly, testing how wax thins and cools, how a smell can change if you hold your breath long enough. It's not wine anymore, not exactly, but it's chemistry, and chemistry, like humor, is a loophole. When she's caught, she calls it experiments in devotional distillation. The sisters don't know if that's science or blasphemy, so they punish both. Deprived of ink, she writes with patience. A nail becomes a quill, the wall becomes a page, scratched into lime wash behind the low bedstead. The Lord works in mysterious ways, the abbess less so. Under the window slit, silence may be holy, but it's dreadfully dull company. On a beam so small you have to squint. If joy misleads, sorrow must be very proud of itself. You begin to notice the young ones noticing her. They glance when she passes, their eyes bright with the risk of curiosity. Lucia never speaks to them, cannot, but she does one small, treasonous thing. She looks back as if to say, "You're not empty inside this silence." The abbess senses devotion turning into gravity and tightens the rules like a tourniquet. No visits, no candles, no sewing needles in cells. Lucia smiles and says, "Perfect. I've been meaning to practice interiority." Supper disappears for 3 nights. Time stretches thin. Seasons are measured by the particular cold of each corridor. Winter has teeth, summer only a sour breath. Lucia's body slims to the minimum required to carry her mind. Knees protest, hands chap, but the wit refuses to obey the fasting schedule. "Ordered to meditate on death," she whispers. At least it's something new. Ordered to offer up her sufferings, she thinks. I already did. They were called jokes. Rumor, however, eats even stone. A lay sister tasked with scrubbing floors finds the graffiti and copies a line onto a scrap. A novice memorizes it and mouths it into her mattress at night like a contraband prayer. A confessor hears that the worst nun in Christendom is learning to keep company with the moon and leaves troubled, almost impressed. The abbess stops saying Lucia's name. This is supposed to erase a person. Sometimes it does. Not here. Years settle like dust. Lucia hums occasionally. No tune at all, just a thread of sound to prove the throat still works. Once, in the refectory, an ancient hymn burbles out of her unbidden, bright as water over stone. A guard clears her throat too loudly, and the sound breaks. But the guard's hand shakes when she lifts her cup. In a place devoted to perfect control, vibration itself becomes subversion. The end, when it comes, isn't an event. It's an exhale. Lucia lies down in a light like watered milk and stares at the ceiling the way she used to stare at authority, unafraid. "Blessed are thee," she murmurs, hunting for the right mischief, but the words decide to rest. Her fingers relax. The cell is very quiet, the sort of quiet that recognizes it has met its better. By custom, disgraced nuns are buried outside the walls, a patch of earth by a wind-gnarled olive, stones stacked low like a pause. The service is unceremonious, as if humility can be retroactively imposed. The abbess forbids candles, the priest chooses the shortest psalm, the shovel is the only eloquence. Soil thuds a few times and the grave is a grave. Except it doesn't behave. A day later, the dirt looks shifted. Not much, just a small swell, like the earth tried to exhale and thought better of it. A week later, a novice hears faint humming near the olive and runs back to say so, ashamed of the hope that rose in her throat with a phantom note. The abbess blames wind. The confessor blames grief. The miller's wife, who saw Lucia once and thought she had eyes like laughter hiding in church, decides to walk there at dusk anyway. Offerings begin nothing grand, everything precise. A ribbon, a stub of quill, a thimble with a bead of cheap wine in it, bright as garnet, placed where ants might drink absolution for her. No sermons, no chants, just a slow, stubborn human instinct to commemorate the person the institution tried to edit. Pilgrims don't ask for miracles. They ask for something braver, courage. Courage to disobey when obedience becomes a sin against the self. Courage to keep smiling when the room forbids it. You would think the church, having punished a body, might at least control a story. It does not. Stories travel like contraband air. Within a generation, Lucia exists along two roads. In the first, she's a cautionary tale told at lecterns. Curiosity is a sister of catastrophe. Laughter is the gateway vice. In the second, whispered in kitchens and remembered by women who learn to balance duty on one shoulder and dignity on the other. She's a kind of folk saint patron of wit, of girls too bright for rooms designed to dim them, of anyone who has ever been told to be smaller. Both roads meet at the same unmarked patch of dirt. People leave smiling more often than they arrive. And here is where taste returns. Look closely at those offerings. The bead of wine, the sugared nut someone set down last winter, the little green sprig that tries to stay green even after the frost finds it. Joy, once contraband in a chalice, is now a relic in a thimble. You lean closer, closer, to see the color catch and hold the light. Then the scene slides without a seam. The stone cool of the cloister becomes a pane of glass. The olive's shadow sharpens into a window's muntin, and you are suddenly outside a Victorian sweet shop. London smoke greying the sky, children's faces pressed to glass. Rows of candies in apothecary jars glow with impossible brightness, emerald, ruby, lemon sun. Beauty you can eat. A mother counts coins. A boy points at the green on so green they look like summer preserved. The bell on the door lifts its voice. the shop smells of sugar and a rumor of almonds. You step in the way you stepped into the cellar once, and the light inside the jars trembles like a promise. Because across centuries, the same hunger keeps finding new containers. Laughter in a chalice, freedom in a barrel, hope in a jar, and sometimes the thing that glitters most sweetly is the thing you should fear. Step closer to the glass jars. The light glances off their sides, painting emeralds, rubies, and sapphires where only sugar should be. Children's eyes widen because this is what happiness is supposed to look like, isn't it? Vivid, dazzling, edible. A little coin buys a piece of magic. Except the magic is arsenic. In 1858, in the town of Bradford, a confectioner tried to cut corners. He mixed plaster powder into peppermint lozenges to save money. What he didn't know was that his plaster was contaminated with arsenic trioxide pure poison. Within days, 20 people were dead, most of them children. Dozens more writhed in agony, clutching their stomachs, their lips foaming with sweet, lethal dust. The newspapers christened it the Bradford poisoning, and Victorian England gasped. But the truth was worse. Bradford wasn't an anomaly. It was the spotlight catching an entire world of toxic deceit. Color had become the Victorian obsession. The brighter the candy, the fresher it looked. True, green cost a fortune. Copper arsenite, known as Shields Green, was cheaper, brighter, and available in bulk from the same factories that made wallpaper and rat poison. Confectioners knew the risks. Doctors warned about arsenic. But children pointed at jars glowing like gemstones, and profit answered faster than conscience. Think about it. Parents proudly bought those emerald drops for their children, smiling as they unwrapped them. Shopkeepers sold them with warmth. Chemists stocked the pigments and turned their heads. No one wanted to believe sweetness could be deadly. Yet every glistening lozenge was a weapon disguised as a treat. And it wasn't just candy. The Victorian table glittered with chemical lies. Pickles dyed emerald with copper sulfate. Wine sweetened with lead acetate. Bread whitened with alum until it sparkled like snow, but starved the body of nutrients. The more refined your meal looked, the more likely it was to corrode you from within. This was progress, the Industrial Revolution's proudest boast. Factories that could churn out paint, textiles, cosmetics, why not food too? Housewives didn't question the brilliance of peas that stayed green months after harvest or jellies that glowed as though painted by the sun. Brightness meant purity. Purity meant trust. Trust meant a slow, invisible collapse. Imagine biting into one of those sweets, the crunch between your teeth, the rush of sugar on your tongue, and knowing, if you were unlucky, that the next taste would be your last. The irony was brutal. Victorian Britain, so obsessed with morality and cleanliness, was poisoning itself in the pursuit of looking modern. The most advanced civilization in history, they called themselves, while feeding their children death by the handful. And yet the jars gleamed, the coins dropped, the candies sold, because beauty like laughter in a convent was something people couldn't resist, even when it carried a hidden price. If candy was the glitter and bait of Victorian progress, wine was its velvet trap. Picture a mahogany dining table gleaming in gaslight, silver polished, crystal glasses filled with ruby liquid that caught every flicker of the flame. A toast to progress, to empire, to refinement. But behind each raised glass lurked one of humanity's oldest poisons, lead. The Romans had once sweetened their wines with it, boiling grape juice down in lead pots until the metal seeped into every drop. Centuries later, the Victorians repeated the mistake with a confidence only arrogance can provide. Lead acetate, poetically called sugar of lead, was sprinkled into harsh or spoiled wines to mask their bitterness. A sour port could become smooth. A rancid claret could taste imported. A merchant could sell what should have been vinegar as liquid refinement. The results were grotesque. Lead doesn't kill quickly. It seeps, patient and cruel, into the bones, the blood, the nerves. It robs your body from the inside out. Gums darken with a blue line. Hands tremble. Vision blurs. Tempers flare like sudden storms. A woman's pallor chalk white. Fragile was considered fashionable, the very mark of refinement. No one realized her beauty was a symptom of poisoning, and it wasn't only the wine. Pewter mugs leached lead with every refill. Painted ceramics lent their own dose. Water pipes whispered poison into the pure liquid drawn for tea. Even doctors prescribed lead-based tonics for anemia, thinking the metal's density might restore strength. Patients grew weaker, their symptoms doubling under the cure. There is a chilling irony here. The more elegant your table, the more dangerous your dinner. Refinement itself became the toxin, and yet society looked away. Physicians debated quietly, merchants denied furiously, and the public refused to hear the truth. Because to admit that wine itself, the symbol of sophistication, was killing them was to admit they had raised their glasses to progress and drunk death instead. Think about it. How often do we still believe what is beautiful must be good? A clear glass of wine, a flawless loaf of bread, a jar of glowing pickles. How often do we trust appearance because to question it would unravel the comfort of everyday life? The Victorians didn't want to know, they wanted to believe. And so they kept pouring, kept toasting, kept drinking, while the slow poison of their rage ran through their veins disguised as pleasure. On the Victorian table, no meal was complete without its proud little chorus of pickles. Cucumbers glowing green, onions sharp and bright, cauliflower like pale blossoms bobbing in vinegar. Housewives arranged jars on sideboards the way modern homes display flowers, signs of thrift, freshness, and care. But the glow wasn't nature's gift. It was chemistry's trick. Pickles, left alone in brine, lose their color. They fade into limp yellows and muddy browns. Victorians couldn't accept that. They demanded the green of gardens, even when the vegetable had been stewing in vinegar for months. The solution? Copper sulfate. A pinch turned gray cucumbers into dazzling emeralds, revived onions until they gleamed like jewels, and made even the most lifeless cauliflower look freshly plucked. The result was beautiful, yes. It was also poisonous. Copper salts corrode the stomach lining. They burn the throat, scar the kidneys, trigger vomiting, convulsions, collapse. Still, grocers scoop them into jars with a smile, and housewives spoon them proudly onto family plates. Doctors warned. Medical journals printed case reports of copper colica, polite phrase for screaming stomach pain. But merchants shrugged. Everyone does it, and customers, dazzled by the color, kept buying. Imagine a laborer unwrapping his lunch, a crust of bread, a lump of cheese, a couple of those radiant green cucumbers. He eats with pride, thinking himself lucky. Hours later, he doubles over, sweating, groaning, his body rebelling against the beauty he trusted. What makes it worse is the symbolism. Pickles were meant to brighten the dull diet of industrial Britain, to turn grey food into something cheerful. Instead, they carried the same metallic deception that defined the age. A nation obsessed with cleanliness and moral purity was cheerfully eating metal. And it wasn't only pickles. The same copper sulfate that kept cucumbers green also tinted candies, tinted tea leaves, even found its way into bread. Progress had taught Victorians to trust their eyes above all else. If it looked fresh, it must be safe. If it sparkled, it must be pure. But purity in the Victorian kitchen was almost always a lie, and the price of believing that lie was paid not in coins, but in stomachs corroded, children convulsing, families whispering about illness that was really industrial deceit. The age of refinement, once again, revealed itself not in its morals, but in its appetite for poison disguised as beauty. If bread was the staff of life, then Victorian Britain managed to turn it into a staff of deceit. Every morning, loaves lined the windows of bakers' golden crusts, soft interiors, white as purity itself. Bread was more than food. It was symbolism. To buy a fine white loaf meant you were feeding your family with dignity. To eat brown, coarse bread marked you as poor. But good flour was expensive, and bakers discovered a shortcut. Add aluminum sulfate, and suddenly inferior flour became ghostly white. The dough rose higher, the crumb looked refined. The loaf seemed perfect, even angelic. In truth, it was slow poison. Alum hardened bread in the stomach. It blocked digestion, stripped nutrients, and left children pale, weak, and stunted. Doctors called it starvation, in plenty bellies full, but bodies wasting. Working-class families, desperate for cheap loaves, ate the whitest bread they could afford, never realizing they were feeding themselves chalk, plaster, even ground bones mixed with flour. Some bakers used sawdust and pipe clay, alum hiding the evidence like makeup over rot. Think about the cruel irony. The poorer the family, the whiter their bread. And the whiter the bread, the sicker they became. Housewives equated snowy crumb with health, never suspecting that the color came not from purity of wheat, but the chemistry of deceit. Reformers tried to intervene. Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell, the same chemist who exposed milk and wine scandals, tested bread across London and found alum in nearly every sample. His reports shocked Parliament, but bakers cried slander, newspapers mocked reformers as alarmists, and the public kept buying. Bread was too sacred, too symbolic to doubt. And yet, bodies told the truth. Children with rickets, women with chronic constipation, men wasting away despite full stomachs. London's poor were starving not from want, but from the very food they ate daily. Bread, the ancient symbol of nourishment, had become the Industrial Revolution's most efficient disguise. Every slice was an illusion warm, fragrant, deadly in its quiet way. And here lies the bitter lesson. When progress becomes appearance, when purity is measured in whiteness alone, even the most essential food can betray you. If bread was the lie of daily survival, milk was the betrayal of innocence. To Victorians, milk was purity incarnate, white as trust, tied to motherhood, poured for children and the sick. Doctors prescribed it, mothers swore by it, and no breakfast table seemed complete without it. But the cities of industrial Britain had a problem. Too many mouths, not enough cows. The countryside couldn't keep up with the demand pouring into London, Manchester, Liverpool. So urban dairies appeared, filthy sheds hidden behind breweries and factories where cows were kept in darkness, chained in their own waste, fed on steaming heaps of distillery mash. The result was thin, blue-tinged liquid that smelled of rot. No one would buy it as it was, but with a little chemistry, it could be transformed. Chalk was added for whiteness, starch or flour for thickness, and most horrifying water from nearby ditches or contaminated pumps to stretch every pint. Sometimes that water carried sewage. Sometimes it carried cholera. Doctors began noticing the consequences. Infants wasted away from summer diarrhea, polite term for bacterial poisoning. Toddlers convulsed, developed rickets, or simply never grew strong. In some neighborhoods, child mortality soared, and yet the cause sat quietly in a jug on the kitchen table. Think about the betrayal here. Parents bought milk because it symbolized safety. They spooned it into porridge, stirred it into tea, pressed it into their baby's lips with tenderness. They believed they were nourishing their families. In truth, they were delivering chalk, sewage, and disease. The scandal eventually reached the chemist Arthur Hill Hassall. He examined London milk samples and found almost every one adulterated. His findings horrified readers of The Lancet, but change came slowly. The dairy industry was profitable, milk dealers powerful, and the public reluctant to accept that something so sacred could be corrupted. It took decades and countless infant deaths before laws began to regulate milk. And even then, enforcement was patchy, corruption rampant. There is perhaps no darker irony in Victorian food history than this. A society that preached purity and moral strength built its markets on poisoning babies. Milk, the symbol of innocence, became the empire's quietest killer. If milk was betrayal in a jug, meat was corruption laid bare on a butcher's block. Walk through a Victorian market and you'd see it. Carcasses hanging from hooks, sausages coiled like ropes, the smell of iron and brine filling the air. To working-class families, meat was a prize. A Sunday roast meant progress, proof that life was improving. But behind the rosy sheen of beef and the gleam of pork fat lurked a chemistry kit of deceit. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled almost as quickly as it was cut. And where decay threatened profit, deception stepped in. Butchers washed gray flesh in borax, brushed it with formaldehyde, the same chemical used to preserve corpses, or sprinkled it with salicylic acid to mask the stench. Cuts that should have gone to the dogs returned to the table looking deceptively fresh. Housewives saw red meat, never realizing it was the red of chemicals, not blood. Sausages were worse. They were the garbage bin of the meat trade. Scraps of diseased organs, vermin, even horse flesh, minced fine and flavored with heavy spices. The great equalizer of the poor man's table, one reformer called them bitterly. Potted meat, spread on bread with pride, often contained remnants of animals already half rotten. And the slaughterhouses themselves were nightmares. Many stood in narrow alleys behind taverns, with blood washing into gutters, flies thick as smoke, and animals driven to panic before being crudely dispatched. Neighbors sickened from the stench, yet the meat still sold. Clean it, salt it, powder it with dye progress would disguise the rot. Doctors began noticing the symptoms: stomach cramps, ulcers, food poisoning so severe it led to what they delicately called gastric collapse. Families assumed they had overindulged. In truth, they had eaten decay polished into marketable form, but the deception wasn't confined to the poor. The wealthy, too, feasted on corruption. Imported meat, shipped for weeks across oceans without refrigeration, arrived slimy, gray, and crawling with insects. A quick wash in preservatives, a splash of dye, and it was served as prime colonial beef on the tables of London's elite. By the 1880s, public outrage began to swell. Reformers demanded inspections. Journalists exposed the horrors in print. Butchers protested innocence, blaming a few bad apples in the trade. Meanwhile, families kept buying because hunger doesn't wait for regulation. The truth was impossible to ignore. Victorian dinner tables had become chemical laboratories. Candy laced with arsenic, pickles shimmering with copper, bread stretched with alum, milk cut with chalk and sewage, meat embalmed in formaldehyde, tea leaves dusted with Prussian blue. A nation prided on refinement was quietly poisoning itself, one meal at a time. And yet there was progress in the end, progress born not of pride, but of outrage. Reformers like Hassall and campaigners in Parliament pushed through the first food safety laws. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875. Inspectors were appointed, chemists empowered to seize samples, courts finally able to fine or jail the worst offenders. The laws were imperfect, corruption lingered, loopholes flourished, but something had changed. The public no longer trusted brightness as purity. Whiteness no longer guaranteed health. Slowly, painfully, Victorian Britain learned the hardest lesson. Not all progress is improvement. The irony was almost poetic. The century that had prided itself on morality, refinement, and empire had nearly poisoned itself out of existence. Only tragedy forced it to admit the truth. And so, when you look at the bright packages in your modern supermarket, remember Bradford's green lozenges, London's chalky milk, the sausages spiced with rot. Remember that food, like faith, can wear disguises, and that vigilance, the courage to question beauty, is sometimes the only thing that keeps a meal from being a coffin.